The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
Oh, the humanity!
The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every
Let us
city.
not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead.
They say that those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. This is the History Lessons Podcast with certified financial planning practitioner Patrick Huey, author of History Lessons for the Modern Investor, and your guide to financial wisdom in the past, present, and future. You ready? Good. Let's get historical.
Historical indeed. This is the History Lessons Podcast, and I'm Patrick Huey, author of History Lessons for the Modern Investor. And in this episode, we are talking with the author of Naming Gotham, the Villains, Rogues, and Heroes Behind New York's Place Names, Rebecca Bratspies. Rebecca is a professor at CUNY School of Law, where she is the founding director of the Center for Urban Environmental Reform. And she's perhaps best known for the Environmental Justice Chronicles, her EPA award-winning environmental justice comic books made in collaboration with artist Charlie LaGreca-Velasco. Her new project, The Earth Defenders, sponsored by the UN Environmental Program, addresses the dangers that environmental defenders face around the world. Rebecca serves as New York City's Environmental Justice Advisory Board, is a member scholar with the Center for Progressive Reform, a board member of the Environmental Law Collective, and a member of the New York City Bar Environmental Committee. Naming Gotham, the Villains, Rogues, and Heroes Behind New York Place Names, won the New York Public Historian's 2023 Award for Excellence in Local History and the 2024 American Legacy Award for U.S. History. Stay tuned for 3 lessons on fostering your curiosity, finding a competitive advantage, and sticking to your investment process. All of these from Naming Gotham. Let's get started. Well, I thought the book was really cool. And part of the reason I think is because I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and you probably know this because I believe you grew up in Eastern Pennsylvania, but I grew up in the land where every 4 or 5 miles or so is one of those blue and yellow signs about, George Washington slept here or something to that effect. So I grew up with history around me. But what I realized later is I also grew up, a few miles from Presque Isle, which the French pronounce Presqu'île, and Fort LaBeouf. And I didn't really know any reason why there were these French names for these places around me until much, much later. So your book definitely struck a chord as far as understanding all this history that surrounds us, good, bad, and indifferent, and how it shows itself in place names.
Well, thank you. For me, it's been really a fun way into history that I also didn't know that much about. I mean, I grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We all learned the history of Bethlehem. It was founded on Christmas Eve by Count Zinzendorf, who was a Moravian immigrant. And we learned about the Lenape Indians, sort of. We learned that they were there as opposed to are still there.
Right.
But we didn't learn much else. And we didn't learn sort of how the layers of history affect the town that we were living in, and what that meant today, what that meant for us as we make decisions today about today and tomorrow. And so, looking at New York through this lens has really been eye-opening for me. I'm a law professor. It has changed the way I teach law. It also, I just think it's super fun to learn who these people were and to connect dots between roads and people and bridges and development theories and social movements, and just have a better understanding of how we got where we are.
Yeah, that's one of the cool things. And, full disclosure, I didn't visit New York until I was in my 30s. I was kind of intimidated by it in my younger years. But that really jumps out in the book is just how many layers of history, again, good, bad, and indifferent, there are in a city of, what are we at now, about 8 million people there?
About 8 million people.
That started as a little hamlet of 20,000 during the Revolution, and just how those layers have accumulated over time. And this incredible, I know this word gets overused, but it's an incredible amount of diversity in those 5 boroughs.
And always has been. That's, I think, what is so fascinating. And of course, it predates the Hamlet during the Revolution. It was a thriving Lenape-Canarsie community of really complex social interactions of multiple groups for a millennia probably, and then a Dutch outpost, and then a British outpost, and then an American city. And at every stage, there have just been so many people from everywhere here on this tiny little island.
You're absolutely right. There was clearly a society here already for thousands of years before the Europeans showed up and created what became New York City. So I also think it's really interesting the way you came about this project, sitting in traffic and being frustrated and looking up at the signs. You may be the only person I know who has created something worthwhile because of their frustrations in traffic. Tell us a little bit about how you came to this project.
Sure. I grew, as you said, I grew up in Eastern Pennsylvania, and my parents live in a place, they still live in Eastern Pennsylvania, in a place that you can't get to on public transit, which means that if I want to go visit them, I have to drive. And I live in Queens, and in order to get out of Queens and to New Jersey so that I can begin the trek to Pennsylvania, I have to drive on, well, I had to, before I figured out a better way, drive on a road called the Major Deegan Expressway. And whoever named it an expressway, which was Robert Moses, had a very, very bad sense of humor, because it's an expressway in the sense that you get to expressly sit there and express your anger because you're not actually moving. And so the road that I had to take was called the Major Deegan Expressway. And as I would sit there, I was on my way to the George Washington Bridge. Everybody knows who George Washington is, but nobody had a clue who Major Deegan was. And I'm not very well behaved in traffic. I get frustrated. I get angry. And so I would maybe say some bad.
In other words, you're a New Yorker.
Yeah. I would maybe say some bad. Well, most New Yorkers get to avoid it by not driving, but say some bad words, and I would direct them at Major Deegan because I decided it was his fault, naturally. But I had no idea who the guy was. And I would ask people, who was Major Deegan? And nobody else knew. And eventually my family got a little sick of this whole pattern of behavior, but particularly the, who was Major Deegan question. And they said, well, what, you're a researcher. Why don't you find out? So I did. And turns out he was really not particularly an impressive guy, which is surprising given that this major road that goes past Yankee Stadium, right? So it's the route you take to Yankee Stadium. It's the route you take to George Washington Bridge. And it was basically named after a mediocre mid-level bureaucrat. So that, got me interested. And my first thought, of course, was that no woman or no non-white person would ever get anything named after them with the track record that he had. Which is not to say he wasn't a nice guy. Apparently he was very well liked. And he died young, somewhat tragically, and he was very politically connected. So he has a road named after him. But it also got me interested of who are the other people we name roads after. The Major Deegan connects with the Bruckner and the Sheridan and the Van Wyck. And all of a sudden I started to say, wait, all those are last names. All of those are people, not just roads. And then as I started looking at them, I realized, this is a really cool way to understand the history of New York.
Yeah, very cool. And again, it took me back to my childhood and why things are named the way they are named, and why more people aren't curious about those names. Where do they come from? Why are they there? And I think your point is interesting, that right time and right place for a lot of these stories, because they're not named after instantly recognizable figures. I mean, Jackie Robinson, everybody knows, or they should.
some are truly honoring heroes.
Mm-hmm.
Jackie Robinson's a good example. Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, named after the first Black man to be elected to Congress from New York.
That was a cool story that I did not know.
Super cool story. But some of them are just like total grifters who were rich people who, played the system, like McComb's Dam Bridge or like Rikers Island. I mean, talk about Rikers, sort of the villain of the piece. But anybody, for example, who goes out to Long Island, especially if you go to the Hamptons from New York City, right, that the Horace Harding Expressway runs alongside the Long Island Expressway. And it's a service road. No one had a clue who he was. Turns out that he was a super wealthy guy who helped found Smith Barney, among other things. And he really wanted a road to his golf club. And he sort of used his political influence and his wealth to persuade the government to build him his road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a number of those stories in here that you just kind of roll your eyes and go, well, place and time, right? You would never get away with that in 21st century America.
I don't know. I think we see a lot of commandeering of public resources for private benefit. I think that is sort of a big point of contention in our political system, is how much wealthy elites are able to commandeer public resources for their own private benefit. So it's not particularly surprising that we see that in the Revolutionary era with the McCombs, and we see it at the turn of the 19th, 20th century with Horace Harding. But I think having their personal stories helps us understand that broader political dynamic in a different kind of a way, because it takes it out of the partisan politics of today and helps us just see, this is about people with power wanting to use power.
Well, and I think it also highlights, the idea that there's nothing new under the sun, right? This is history, but it's also current events.
Yeah.
And we make these problems throughout time, and then we complain about these problems, but we don't go back very often in history and try to learn from history and how to solve those problems. And I think that that's definitely something that I took away from the book. And I think it's something that you were trying to get through, is that, you could take any of these stories and probably slap it into the newspaper today, and, with a few adjustments, it would work.
Yeah, actually, one of the really cool things I discovered in writing this is just how much the newspapers of the past were just gossipy and full of misinformation and conflicting versions of events. And, we treat it as though it's a record of the past, as opposed to exactly the same as it is today, where you have newspapers that are rushing to get the story out first, or they are, and not just newspapers, but all news media at this point, have a partisan slant, that have their own agenda. And, that's not new either.
You mentioned that, one of your goals in writing this was to consider, or to have readers consider who gets to decide what counts as history. And I don't often quote Broadway shows, but when I do, it's Hamilton, because that made me think of the line from that show, which is, who lives, who dies, who tells your story.
Yep.
And a lot of history is written by quote unquote the winners. And you really do have to dig deep in order to get both sides, if not 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of the same event, in order to make a judgment as a historian about what is factual, or how things actually happened.
Yeah. So can I tell you a story that's not in the book that I think is a really good representation of that? So there's a park in the north of New York City called the Van Cortlandt Park.
Okay.
Named after the Van Cortlandts, the Dutch family here before the British took over. Stephanus Van Cortlandt was the first Dutch person to be the mayor of New York as opposed to New Amsterdam. He was closely allied with the British. Very, very wealthy family, enslaved a lot of people, and made a fortune. Came with a fortune, but also made a fortune by co-opting the labor of enslaved people. And our listeners might be most from, well, I don't know, this may date me, but if you think about the movie The Warriors, if anybody knows what that is anymore, right? It was a movie about like the dystopia of New York. It starts with this big gang truce meeting that's called by this leader to try to get the gangs not to be fighting with each other. And someone assassinates him, and they assassinate him in Van Cortlandt Park. And then the movie is about one particular gang, the Warriors, trying to get back from Van Cortlandt Park in the far north to Coney Island, which is their home base in the far south. So anyway, that's Van Cortlandt Park. But there was a point to this story when I started, and that is that the process of grappling with, right, who lives, who dies, who tells the story. New York has tried to sort of really complicate Van Cortlandt Park as a celebration of the Van Cortlandts by recognizing that a lot of other people lived and died on that land, on that estate, besides the very elite Van Cortlandt family. And in fact, in 2021, I think, date might be a little off, what had been known as Van Cortlandt Lake was renamed Hester and Piero's Mill Pond in honor of the enslaved miller who worked there, and Piero and his wife Hester, who lived at the lake, who ran the mill, and who were one of the engines of the fortune that the Van Cortlandts developed. So, it's a reclaiming of a fuller version of the story that helps us understand how we got where we are.
I think that we are really living in a renaissance for history based on what you just said. You're seeing so many more histories now, based on the way things are published, and I self-published my book, and I'm working on a biography that I'll self-publish as well. That I believe has really made it more available to go out and find stories that aren't about generals or rich people. Because most of history is, people slogging by and getting by on the minimum amount and just living their lives.
But for some reason, we call that anthropology, not history, right?
Yeah, very true. Very true. And I think you're getting to see a little bit more democratization of history as more and more people ask the question of, well, what else you got? And that I think was your book, which is what else you got? What is the history of these places? And, it's not all George Washington slept here. And thank God, because I had enough of that growing up.
Yeah, he slept in a lot of places, that's for sure. He must have just gone for naps everywhere.
Yeah, he was narcoleptic apparently. So if you don't mind, your book has won a couple of awards. Tell us about those. The New York Public Historians Award for Excellence and the American Legacy Award for U.S. History. Tell us about those a little bit.
So I was really honored. I mean, obviously you're honored to win an award, but I didn't even know I was nominated for either of them. And particularly the award from the Public Historians of New York was incredible, because New York, by law, every town has a public historian, right? They're not necessarily a full-time city employee, but every single town has somebody in that role. And their task is to manage archives, if there are archives, or to try to create archives if there aren't. Obviously New York City has a pretty sophisticated set of historical records, but many, many small towns don't. And they're trying to capture that, and they're trying to understand New York through this process. And I got to go to the awards ceremony where I got to meet all of the historians from all of the small towns across New York. And it was so interesting. And it was their annual meeting where they presented the award. And so I got to give a little bit of speech, but I was very short because they had other people to who were more interesting, I think, and I didn't want to be in their way. But I also got to listen to all the talks, and it was fascinating how many of the talks, without sort of centering who are the people that we name things after, were touching on exactly that issue and that question, and talking about the layers of naming over time and what that told us about the evolution of the city of New York and the state of New York, and how we're trying to both retain and preserve and understand that history, but also embrace today and who's living in places today and what their culture's like, which could be very different from the people that a place is named after.
Mm-hmm. Well, congratulations on both of those.
Thank you.
Well earned. Talk a little bit about how you approached this book, because I did think it was unique as far as the way you write and research.
Well, like I said, I'm a law professor, so I really just cosplay as a historian. I'm not a trained historian. But I am a really good researcher, because to be a lawyer, and certainly to be a law professor and scholar, I need to be. And so I sort of brought that lens of legal analysis to history. And so I was looking for sort of where are the touch points where there were legal transformations and legal changes, and how is that captured in names. But I also wanted it to be really sort of gossipy and accessible, and not, some kind of you are now reading history, but the kind of story about somebody that would be interesting. Because these people, that's the other thing, is these people were all really interesting. Even Major Deegan, for all that I was sort of making fun of him a little bit as a mediocre guy, super interesting,
right?
Character. And there's so many stories about him, some of which made it into the book, some of which didn't. And so I wanted to use contemporary sources. I didn't want to read what other people said about these people, historians looking back. So I was looking for their own writings, speeches that they gave, material culture. Like for Major Deegan, I have a whole bunch of the brochures from the lunches that he gave, because he was well known for spending public funds to have lunches for visiting dignitaries. And I used a lot of newspaper reports and other sort of contemporary sources, so that you could get a feel of what the people seemed like to the people around them.
And I love that approach. I think that too often we rely, even just in our day-to-day lives, on secondary sources, and you get somebody else's bias when you do that. So when you can peel away those layers, and it's not always possible, I'm finding that out again as I research a biography, but the more you can jump in and hear exactly what those people said or wrote, the better you're going to be prepared to go represent them to whatever audience you are now writing for or speaking for.
Right. Though you can't take what they say as at face value.
No, never. They're human beings too.
Yeah.
The research piece is what fascinates me. And you said that, you kind of write and research at the same time. Not that you're recommending that to folks, but tell me a little bit about that process and how you found that to work out for you as you were going through this book.
Well, it's an approach that I developed as a scholar writing, because most of my writing is scholarly legal writing that was probably not be of any interest to your listeners. Books like Transboundary Harm in International Law, Lessons from the Trail Smelter Arbitration. It was a barn burner.
But we'll put a link to that one in the show.
It's actually, it's again, fascinating story, but perhaps a fascinating story for a smaller slice of society.
Yeah.
I found over the years that I think better as I'm writing. So I will start writing, like, here's my idea, and I'll just do like a big dump of writing, and without worrying about order or structure or anything. And then as I research, I'll realize, oh, this piece goes here. Oh, no, I don't want that at all. Oh, I need to restructure this whole thing. And so I'll write out, I'll be writing. And then as I learn more about the person, I'll change what I'm writing. So I guess I do some research beforehand, some preliminary research, so that I can have an idea of what the thread is going to be for a particular person's story. And then interestingly, as I was doing this book, I discovered all of these connections between people in the book that I didn't know about beforehand. So I was constantly revising.
I noticed that there are a lot of back references to other entries, other chapters on characters who intertwined with each other.
Yeah, and people that you wouldn't necessarily expect to have intertwined with each other, which I think was so fascinating.
Especially in a big city.
And especially across history.
Yeah.
Like the intersections weren't always, these are contemporaries and they are interacting in ways that you might not expect. Like, going back to Major Deegan, because he's one of my favorites, to be honest. He served under General George Washington Goethals, and the Goethals Bridge, which is in Staten Island, was named after General George Washington Goethals, who was the guy who finished the Panama Canal. He was in charge of finishing the Panama Canal. And like Major Deegan, he never saw a day on the battlefield, which is sort of interesting that you've got these two major pieces of infrastructure in New York City named after military figures who never saw battle, which is not to say that the work that they did wasn't important and worthwhile. But when you come at it with no knowledge, your assumption is that this is someone who died some heroic fashion, of course. As opposed to dying in Goethel's case of old age in his bed, which is what we wish for everybody, and in Major Deegan's case, complications of a medical procedure gone awry in his 40s.
Well, yeah, we've been trained with that lens of when you see something named after somebody who has a title like general or colonel or something like that, you expect some sort of war hero or some type of heroics like that. But I think it's interesting what you said there, as far as these were people who made massive impacts on the world who just happened to be in the military. And carried that title. Yeah,
or in Major Deegan's case, medium impact on the world.
Yeah, well, he's had a major impact on your commute.
Yes, that's for sure. Well, interestingly, though, like the Kosciuszko Bridge or the Pulaski Bridge, there's no general in front of their names, even though they were both Revolutionary War generals.
I noticed that with Pulaski, which is odd to me, because he is a legitimate Revolutionary War hero.
And so is Kosciuszko. And it's just interesting how another interesting aspect of naming is who gets named by their military title and who doesn't. I think maybe for Pulaski and Kosciuszko, both of those were named, both of those bridges, which are in connect Queens and Brooklyn, were named very soon after the Germans invaded Poland. So it may be that they were trying to emphasize the Polish name more than the Revolutionary War, service.
Interesting. Can we talk a little bit about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is John Jacob Astor? And the reason is, in one of the chapters in my book, I talk a lot about Wilson Price Hunt, and spoiler alert, that is the biography that I am working on currently. And I find that story incredibly fascinating for a number of reasons. First is, going back to what I said about my hometown and the French influence there that I had no idea of. Astor was one of the first people to really tap into what the French had built across the Great Lake region. Friendly relations with the tribes, for the most part, in the interior.
Yeah.
And, he really tapped into that in a way that nobody had thought to do previously. And, Wilson Price Hunt was the leader of the Overland Party that eventually founded Astoria in Oregon. Things did not go well there.
No.
We can talk about that at a later time. But just give me a little bit more on John Jacob, because I find him fascinating. He was, kind of a bootstrap guy from Germany who built himself into the country's first millionaire, which should be a feel-good story, but isn't always.
Yeah. So he was a German immigrant, and his brother, his older brother, his father was a butcher. His older brother one of his brothers went to London. Another one came here as a Hessian and promptly deserted and made his own butcher shop. And John was the younger brother. There were a lot of kids in the family. And then the mom died and the dad remarried, and relations were not good. And so he decided to come join his brothers. And first he went to London, and then he came to New York. And he had this idea originally that he was going to make musical instruments, but he wound up doing what immigrants do. He found the immigrant community. He worked as a messenger and transporting stuff for butchers. He knew about butcher shops, but he clearly didn't want to be a butcher. He married his landlord's daughter, and that's how he got his start. That's where he got some capital. And he started, as you said, we
should explain that's the old dowry days.
Yeah. So his landlord's daughter, the landlord was someone with property, somebody wealthier. He married up, is what I would say. And in marrying up, he got a stake of capital from her family that he used to start his first trading venture. And he became convinced. The story is, I don't know if it's true or not, but the story is that on the boat over, he met some German guy who was a fur trader who convinced him that this was the way to make a fortune. And so you can look at all of his moves in New York as strategic moves to get access to capital to enter the fur trading business, which he did. And he was phenomenally successful, in part because he was willing to illegally trade booze and guns for fur. And that's where he built his first fortune, was in fur trading. And he sort of tried to, and as you said, he sent the overland expedition. I'm skipping over a whole bunch of stuff to try to be simple here, but he ran into a problem, which was President Jefferson had established the Embargo Acts, which prohibited trade with Great Britain, and that killed his business. And so the company that he had created to sort of fund the overland expedition just disappeared overnight. And all the people who'd invested in it presumably lost all their money. He did not lose all of his money. And he started investing, among other things, in real estate.
Yep. And that's where the second fortune comes from, right?
Yeah, and the huge, enormous fortune. He wound up owning vast swaths of Lower Manhattan. And in fact, on his deathbed, he apparently said, if I had to do it over again, I'd buy all of Manhattan.
Yeah.
He was very much a symbol of the before the era of the robber barons, he was a symbol of excess and wealth. And he was hated by the masses because he was viewed as very extractive, which he was, because he made fortunes and some of his investors made fortune, but his workers did not make fortunes. They barely made enough to live.
And now he's got a neighborhood in Queens named after him.
Oh, funny story there, right? He never set foot in Astoria, which is actually where I live. He was being solicited for a donation for a women's school, a girls' school they were trying to start in Astoria. And the tried and true, I guess it's a university model now, but probably a private school model now as well. Find a wealthy donor, massage them, get them to make a sizable donation, and name something after them. So they were working Astor, who had a summer house across the river and could see Astoria. He lived right next to the Gracies, which Gracie Mansion is now where the mayor of New York lives.
Mm-hmm.
And he eventually agreed to make the donation, and the legislation to name Astoria, because it had to be done by the state legislature, proceeded, and Astoria was named after him. And then he made a really piddling, tiny donation that was like a couple of zeros short of what they were hoping for the school. But and there was actually a movement to rename the city because they felt like he'd done them wrong, but that didn't succeed. So it's still Astoria.
Yep. Yeah. And he never set foot in Astoria, Oregon either.
That is true.
Still got his name on it. Which I find interesting because, I lived on the West Coast for about 15 years, including in Oregon or near Oregon. Lived and worked in Portland, and I didn't know the story of Astoria until Peter Sark's book came out about the founding of the trading venture there. And it's interesting to me how, we mentioned how characters in your book seem to intersect. I always find it interesting how history intersects, and how I'll come across a topic and I'll say, oh, that's interesting, I want to know more about that. And I'll read something about it. And then tangentially, something comes across that is related to that. And I go, oh, I wouldn't have known that, or I wouldn't have come across that. I wouldn't have known what was going on if I hadn't read this.
Yeah, I wouldn't have been able to take that particular fact and put it in context and understand, oh, these are, interacting with the same thing. It's, oh, Jefferson's embargo acts were doing this also.
Yeah, that's a good example. That's a good example. And yeah, history is iterative, and you really do need to continue to go down the rabbit hole once you've started, because there's always something else around the corner that's going to catch your attention. I think, anyway. Yeah. Some people will disagree.
I feel like we'd be remiss if we left the John Jacob Astor without talking about the social legacy of his family, because Mrs. Astor ruled New York society with an iron fist, and some of the Astor, and I can't remember the name of. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name, but one of the Astor children went over to England and married into the peerage and wound up actually being the first woman elected to Parliament. So, from that base of wealth that he generated, an immense amount of social and political power was sort of cultivated.
Yeah, and I do love the story. I guess love the story is the wrong way to put it, but I find it interesting. One of his sons was on the Titanic when it sank. I don't know if it's true, but there is a story that he came on deck and said, "I wanted ice for my drink, but this is ridiculous." I don't know if that's true. I hope it is, because it's a great story.
It would be nice if it were true. Yeah, there definitely there were Gracies on the Titanic.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the Gracies survived, and to his dying day was reliving the nightmare of trying to rescue people on the Titanic. Vanderbilt's on the Titanic, because it was the fancy ship, and this was its maiden. In fact, oh God, my brain is like a sieve this morning. I'm sorry. Frick was supposed to, Henry Frick was supposed to have been on the Titanic, but his wife broke her ankle. And so they stayed longer in Europe and didn't get on the Titanic, or they would have died too.
Yeah. And there was a story about the statue that.
Oh, yeah. Well, you get to, right. Gertrude Whitney was Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. She was commissioned to make the memorial statue for the Titanic that was run by the Civic Women's Organization, and they wanted the memorial to commemorate all of the men in first class who had died, which was, I get it, that was their people,
right.
But the fact is that most of the people who died in the Titanic were not men in first class. They were families, women and children and men in steerage and second class and et cetera, because none of them made it into the lifeboats. There weren't even lifeboats for them. Her brother had died on the Lusitania. So for her, that was a very personal project. And the statue that she made was the inspiration for that iconic scene on the in the movie where, you know, Jack is like this on the crowd. That's what her statue looks like. And you can still see it. It's in Washington, D.C. She was a fascinating character because she had a youthful love affair with a woman named Esther Hunt, who was the daughter of a very famous architect, William Hunt, who was designing all of the houses for the Vanderbilts, including the Breakers. And her mother, like appalled, immediately married her off to Whitney, who she had absolutely nothing in common with, and they had. They stayed married and had some kids, but they did not have a particularly close or happy marriage, and both of them pretty much went their separate ways.
Yeah, we'll put up a picture of the iconic statue because you will immediately know what we're talking about.
It's hard to paint it in words.
What's your favorite part about being a New Yorker?
The fact that every time I walk down the street, I am interacting with people who aren't like me, who maybe don't speak the languages that I speak, who eat different food, who wear different clothing, and that I get to sort of try their food. I get to learn about the world in my little microcosm.
What's your least favorite thing about being a New Yorker?
Traffic. Traffic and
that was a softball.
Yeah, I know. Like, if we're in the throes of a big controversy here in New York because the governor canceled congestion pricing, which was intended to reduce traffic driving into Manhattan while also raising money for public transit. And the thing that I kept coming back to over and over again in this book is how all of the infrastructure that we have was supposed to resolve what was called, at era after era, intolerable congestion.
Yep.
And none of it did, because building more roads or widening roads just invites more vehicular traffic.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the purpose of the Holland Tunnel. That was the purpose of the Pulaski Skyway. That was the purpose of the Van Wyck Expressway. The express justification was to resolve congestion, and all it did was create new synonyms for congestion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like we said, we create our own problems, and if we don't learn from history, we'll keep doing the same things over and over and over again.
Yeah. But we don't have to. We could do it differently.
I'd like to believe so. I would like to believe so, but it requires a study of history, and you and I think, are battling an uphill battle when it comes to that.
Yeah.
That's okay. I'm happy to be a warrior in this particular sense of the word. But I think that there is a real lack of, how do I want to say this? A real lack of curiosity in the culture around us, and I don't know why that is. Well, I have some ideas, but if you think about it, I have a 10-year-old son, and so I'm very close to that period of time where everything was why. Mm-hmm. And when he becomes a teenager, I think we'll probably go back to some of that. Why? But as we become adults, it's kind of like art. Everybody thinks they're an artist when they're a kid, but by the time you're 25, it's not cool to like art or to be an artist.
Or you have to be really, really good at it. Like, you can't just draw a picture because it's fun.
Yeah.
You have to make art.
Right. You have to be an artist.
Yeah.
You're not just making art. And I think it's the same thing with curiosity. I think as we get older, we just become less curious about the things around us, to our detriment. And that's one thing I hope that your book will highlight, is that there's some really interesting things going on around you if you stop and take the time and pay attention to what's out there.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily work. Like, it can be fun, and it can make your life more interesting and more fun, as well as giving you a broader perspective on any particular, problem you're trying to deal with.
And it makes you more fun at dinner parties.
Well, part of the reason I wrote this book was I became one of those people who was like, oh, did you know? And, nobody wants to be like, have factoids shoved at them. So this was a way to sort of channel that instinct.
If there is ever a category on Jeopardy, place names in New York City, my money's on you.
Yeah, I think I would do well on that. Though there are so many. I mean, the book just scratches the surface. There were so many people I had to cut from the book because I ran out of pages.
Sequel? Are you working on it? Are you thinking about it?
I don't know. It was a lot of work. I mean, I have a day job as a law professor,
Yeah.
and I have 2 books that I sort of need to finish in that context. But maybe. I've been writing a lot of blog posts because I do really love this writing, and the blog posts are probably shorter than a chapter would be, but it's a way to get some of those ideas out there.
Yeah, and you never know. Can always turn those into the sequel later on.
It's possible.
Well, good. Well, this was fun. The book is great for New Yorkers and non-New Yorkers alike. It'll keep your attention. To your point, I love the gossipy nature of it. It's like a People magazine for historians, and very enjoyable. I hope people will do this for their own areas of the country because there is a lot of interesting history out there in the way that places are named.
I have gotten a lot of requests. Could you do this for Indianapolis, or could you do this for Washington, D.C.? And my response is always like, no, you do it. This is your, one of my hopes is that people reading the book will sort of look around their own community and say, hey, I wonder who that was.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I hope you're right. And I hope that people do take that up and carry on with, your vision for New York and their own cities and towns.
Me too.
Rebecca, thank you so much for your time today. I think the book is great, Naming Gotham. If you get a chance, pick that up. There'll be links in the show notes. And thank you again for your good work and for getting people interested in history.
Well, thank you. It's really been a pleasure talking with you.
Here are 3 lessons for the modern investor from Rebecca Bratspies' book, Naming Gotham. Number 1, be curious, not judgmental. Learn from history. As investors, it's easy to fall into the trap of quick judgments. You may look at a company or a market trend and form an opinion almost instantly based on past experiences or just surface level data. You could look at Major Deegan's history and be unimpressed at first, but here's where the saying popularized by the TV show Ted Lasso, be curious, not judgmental, becomes crucial. When you approach investing with curiosity, you're open to learning, asking questions, and gathering deeper insights. Instead of dismissing a company because it doesn't fit into a traditional mold or because a certain sector's performance is lackluster recently, start by asking why. Why is this happening? What factors are driving these trends? Is there potential for a turnaround or growth in the future? Judgment tends to close doors. Curiosity opens them. It encourages you to explore different sectors, companies, and opportunities that others might just overlook. While everyone else is writing off a stock or market because of current challenges, your curiosity might lead you to discover something others missed. Change in leadership, a new product launch, or an untapped market. Stay curious about what's happening around you. Dive deeper into research. Ask questions and seek to understand before you make a decision. By leading with curiosity, you'll likely spot opportunities where others see only risks. Being curious and not judgmental, that's a modern investor's edge. Lesson 2, identify and leverage your competitive advantages, just like John Jacob Astor did. Astor's life is a testament to the power of vision, adaptability, diversification, and long-term planning in building and sustaining wealth. His strategies and principles are timeless, and the modern investor can still learn a little something from the nation's first millionaire. In the fur trade, Astor leveraged his relationships and knowledge to secure exclusive deals with the Native American tribes and in European markets. He may have bent some rules, as alluded to in the podcast, but historians debate that. So let's just say his ability to navigate complex trade networks gave him a competitive edge. As a modern investor navigating amongst big hedge funds, big banks, and big trading firms, what is your competitive advantage? Well, your competitive advantage as a small investor is that you don't have to report quarterly to a board overseeing your every move. And that should make you less short-term focused. Lesson 3, find a process that works for you. Rebecca's writing process isn't right for everyone, but it works for her. For investors, sticking to their own process is crucial for long-term success. Markets are filled with noise, daily fluctuations, media hype, and opinions from countless sources. That can tempt even seasoned investors to stray from their strategy. However, a disciplined approach grounded in research and personal risk tolerance, well, that can help investors navigate volatility with a little bit of clarity and confidence. By trusting the process, investors avoid impulsive decisions driven by emotions or short-term market swings. Consistency, not chasing the latest trend, builds the foundation for sustainable growth and the confidence to weather the inevitable ups and downs in any market. Well, my fellow historians, that is all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed our time with Rebecca Bratspies. Be sure to pick up her book on Amazon and visit her website, RebeccaBratspies.com. That's it right there. And while you're on Amazon, check out my book as well. That's History Lessons for the Modern Investor. Be sure to do all the social stuff with us. Like this episode. Follow us wherever you see or hear your podcasts. We're available on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Until next time, we'll take another rollicking romp through the past and make an investment in your future with History Lessons for the Modern Investor. Goodbye, everybody.